Hello and welcome to Ohio Lake Erie Commission's webinar about the 2020 Draft Domestic Action Plan. My name is Mary McCarran and I'm hosting today's public meeting and webinar. With me are Ohio Lake Erie Commission Executive Director Joy Melanu and Environmental Specialist Sandra Kosick-Sills, and from Ohio EPA, Chief of Surface Water Tiffany Kavalak and Environmental Specialist Paul Gledhill. In a moment, Sandra and Paul will provide an overview of the plan. I'd also like to note that we are recording this webinar. I want to emphasize that this webinar pertains to the Draft Domestic Action Plan only. We do have another webinar scheduled next week to cover the Draft Integrated Report. I understand there may be some confusion on which webinar covers what topics. At the end of the presentation, we will hold a short Q&A session limited to clarifying questions about the information presented. Clarifying questions will be answered as time permits. Participants may submit unanswered questions with their written comments for Ohio Lake Erie Commission's consideration. We will save all questions and comments submitted during the webinar. Before I turn things over, I have a couple of tips about the technical end of today's webinar. You should see a floating control panel on your computer screen. During the webinar, the sound may fade in and out due to your internet connection. If you experience problems with the sound during the webinar, either wait a moment or two to see if it's restored, or using the icon on the floating control panel, close or disconnect from the audio portion of the presentation and reconnect to restore audio. Please use the chat feature to report and receive assistance with technical issues. Also, please use the chat feature to submit questions about the presentations. We are not using the Q&A part of this webinar, so please submit your questions via the chat. Sandra and Paul will now go over the draft plan.
Okay. Am I coming through, Mary?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. My name is Sandra Kosick-Sills of the Ohio Lake Erie Commission, and I am here today to talk to you about the Ohio Domestic Action Plan 2020. Joining me a little later in the presentation is Paul Gledhill of Ohio EPA. The Ohio Lake Erie Commission is a state agency tasked to preserve Lake Erie's natural resources, to protect the quality of its waters and ecosystem, and to promote economic development of the region by ensuring the continuation of policies and programs of state government pertaining to water quality, toxic substances, and coastal resource management. Commission agencies include Ohio EPA, the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, the Ohio Department of Agriculture, the Ohio Department of Health, the Ohio Department of Transportation, and the Ohio Development Services Agency, as well as 5 private citizens members appointed by the governor. The commission also oversees the management of the Lake Erie Protection Fund. The Lake Erie Protection Fund is funded by sales of the Lake Erie license plate, and an example of which is in the upper corner of this slide. This is the view of Lake Erie that we all want to see: fishable, swimmable waters, nice view, strong economy. This image is courtesy of Rich McBride, Life on Lake Erie Photo Contest winner in 2013. However, in recent years, large harmful algae blooms have been observed in Lake Erie. And this is an example from last year, the summer of 2019. Our harmful algal bloom season was over early last year, a little bit more in September instead of October, but it was widespread at its height in August. And I have here images. This is from the same day, the satellite photo and what you would see on the shoreline at Maumee Bay State Park. In looking at the HAB Severity Index developed by NOAA using models using a model that relates nutrient levels to algae cell biomass, we see this trend of increased harmful algal blooms. Last year's final number was a 7.3 on this scale. Note that the blooms have been mostly significant severity since 2008, with a couple of exceptions in the dry years, which would be 2012 and 2016. Under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, Annex 4, goals have been set to protect Lake Erie. These are the Annex 4 goals written as ecosystem objectives: reducing harmful algal blooms in the Western Basin and increasing dissolved oxygen levels in the bottom of the Central Basin. And these are the two goals that apply to Ohio. There are also goals for the eastern basin of Lake Erie I won't be addressing here today. These objectives have been translated into pounds or metric tons of nutrient loads to be reduced. I'm not going to cover that in detail here, but it is described in detail in the Ohio Domestic Action Plan document itself and in a report referenced there by the Annex 4 subcommittee. So what is the source of the nutrients that are feeding this algae bloom? These data are from the Ohio EPA Nutrient Mass Balance Study. That report lays out the method for calculating these loads and portions attributed to the general source categories. Basically, the loads that are at the pour point that's known from data collected by Heidelberg University. And then the point source loads and the HSTS estimate are subtracted from the total, and the remaining amount is non-point source, both urban and agricultural. No surprise, in Maumee and the Maumee River watershed, the largest contributor is agricultural non-point source. More on that in a minute. The Sandusky River and the Portage River have very similar land use, and they have similar ratios of source of nutrients. The Cuyahoga here, you can see it's different. It's a much more urbanized watershed, and so our point sources and HSTS are a greater portion of the load. Northwest Ohio is a center of intensive agricultural land use, over 90% in Henry and Putnam counties. Contrast that with Cuyahoga County, an urban area with very little agricultural land use. In addition to the preponderance of agriculture, research indicates that agricultural land use produces a higher rate of nutrient loss through runoff than urban land use. Thus, we know that most of the source of the excess nutrients to Lake Erie is due to agricultural land use. That makes addressing agricultural best management practices in Northwest Ohio, in particular in the Maumee River watershed, the highest priority action for Ohio. One significant new initiative to do this work is Governor DeWine's H2 Ohio effort. This funding is for the agencies to address statewide challenges. Roughly half of the funding that you see described here on the slide would be used for the western basin of Lake Erie, and the funding to ODA and ODNR is for projects specifically that will reduce nutrient losses from agriculture. This is funding for each year in Ohio's 2-year budget cycle. In other words, this same amount will be available starting next state fiscal year on June 2020. So here we have ODA for this state fiscal year has $30.3 million. ODNR has $46.2 million. Ohio EPA has $8.675 million. And the idea here is to get money on the ground to address water quality challenges. And so this is going to be aimed primarily at projects that are going to put actual practices in. And again, about half of this funding is dedicated for the Lake Erie watershed. H2 Ohio has been structured into 8 areas of effort under 3 groupings. The first group, prevention, is primarily agricultural BMPs. The second group, restoration, will focus on wetlands restoration and enhancement that will slow runoff and reduce nutrient movement, along with HSTS remediation and improvements in treatment technologies. The third category is science research and measurement, which provides support for monitoring activity. And for more information on H2 Ohio, please see the website h2.ohio.gov. So we have folded this H2 Ohio effort into the existing Ohio Domestic Action Plan. The Ohio Lake Erie Commission is leading a multiple agency effort to address nutrient reduction needs on Lake Erie, along with Ohio EPA, Ohio Department of Agriculture, Ohio Department of Natural Resources, and the Ohio Department of Health. So this is our 4 main points of focus in the Ohio DAP. We will be building on the existing pieces and adding new components that are part of the H2 Ohio initiative. These are the 4 key action areas that we want to highlight. The first one is to establish science-based priorities for agricultural best management practices and state programs to support H2 Ohio efforts. The second one is reliance on the ability of wetland restoration to remove nutrients and focus by ODNR to restore and enhance wetlands for nutrient reduction as part of H2 Ohio. And the third one is updated actions for communities to receive H2 Ohio support for home sewage treatment system remediation and other community efforts. And the fourth one is to integrate the role of watershed planning at the local level for siting projects to reduce nutrients efficiently, including a distribution of the load reduction throughout the Maumee River watershed based on the Ohio EPA nutrient mass balance method. Through H2 Ohio, these 10 conservation practices were identified for H2 Ohio funding. These practices were selected because they are both cost-effective and efficient at removing total phosphorus. We did not have sufficient data to evaluate practices only for dissolved reactive phosphorus, which is also a very important factor. These practices focus on total phosphorus, but their ability to also reduce dissolved fraction of phosphorus was also factored in the selection process. ODA is already starting to roll out programs to incentivize and support increased adoption of these practices. Practice number 10 here, it could be considered an agricultural BMP, but it's going to be the focus of ODNR, and we'll talk about that in a minute. At this time, ODA is not yet funding water management projects such as 7 and 8, the drainage water management or the 2-stage ditch construction. That will come later. In order to participate in the BMP programs under H2 Ohio, each farmer will need to first work with the County Soil and Water Conservation District to create a nutrient management plan for the farm and have it certified. This will be an independent certification through the Ohio Agriculture Conservation Initiative, an independent non-governmental organization made up of farm organizations, environmental groups, and Ohio State University. I will give a brief overview of the 7 practices that ODA is already rolling out programs for. First of all, soil testing. A soil test is essential to determine soil fertility levels and make good nutrient management decisions. Ohio will encourage the development of nutrient management plans with payments to farmers with certified NMPs. Plans must be reviewed and approved by the local Soil and Water Conservation District. Variable rate fertilization. And this is a practice applying specific fertilizer levels based on the need of each sub-acre to reduce fertilizer application without risk of losing yield. Involves some fairly sophisticated GIS technology right there on the tractor. In this case, the program from ODA will be a payment per acre that's under this practice once the nutrient management plan is in place and the practice is implemented and documented. There's 2 additional practices, subsurface nutrient placement. This is the method of putting the essential crop nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium below the soil surface, right in the root zone, available for plants to uptake. Similar to the other program, it's a payment per acre under subsurface placement or manure incorporation to farmers once the voluntary nutrient management plan is in place and the practice is implemented. Conservation crop rotation. This involves planting certain small grain crops to reduce erosion and enrich the soil, thus reducing runoff and sediment delivery. Again, this program will provide incentives to farmers to utilize this practice. In addition to H2 Ohio, there's Senate Bill 299 funding for this program. And then cover crops. There's an example here from Blanchard demonstration farms. These are oats and radishes. When planted after the main harvest, cover crops reduce erosion, hold nutrients in the soil, and improve soil health. And then these are planted to temporarily protect the ground from wind and water erosion and to supply living roots to the soil during times when cropland is not adequately protected. Edge of field buffers, we have an example here of a recent project. The green areas are the buffer areas that have been installed in the waterways. That's going to collect the runoff from these fields and filter it through these perennial plants before the water goes off into the stream. Similar to the other programs, farmers with the nutrient management plans who install these practices can receive payments if these are installed on their farms. For the wetlands portion of the program, ODNR will be using their portion of the H2 Ohio funds to expand wetland creation and enhancement, starting with Northwest Ohio, but eventually moving throughout the Lake Erie watershed and then statewide. These will be both coastal wetland and inland or streamside wetland projects. And there's a detailed listing of these in the appendices to the Domestic Action Plan. This is an example of what one of these inland wetlands might look like. And we had previously in the Domestic Action Plan prior to this been looking at the Sandusky Bay Initiative, which is adding coastal wetlands. This would be a before example. And then here's after. So adding more of a natural filter system to the shoreline. Now I'm going to bump it over to Paul, and he is going to talk in a little bit more detail about some of the work that Ohio EPA has been doing related to the Domestic Action Plan.
Thank you, Sandra. This is Paul Gledhill from Ohio EPA. This is the last slide about H2 Ohio in our PowerPoint, and we wanted to point out that H2 Ohio is also supporting projects for fixing and replacing hundreds of failing home sewage treatment systems in low-income areas, funding water infrastructure projects in disadvantaged communities to provide safe drinking water and sewer services, and increasing water quality monitoring across the state. Now, I'll also note here that the community-based nutrient section of the Domestic Action Plan includes material accounting for nutrients delivered from permitted point sources, such as wastewater treatment plants, combined sewer overflows, and home sewage treatment systems. Go ahead and change the slide. So one of the Domestic Action Plan's goals is to support watershed planning efforts. Each watershed plan, also known as a 9-element non-point source implementation strategy, allows local stakeholders to focus on small watersheds to identify best management practices and projects that could be installed when funding becomes available. So the 319 and GLRI funding sources, they require these plans to be developed before implementation dollars become available. In the Maumee River watershed, the new Domestic Action Plan provides far-field total phosphorus load reduction targets that can be used as goals for these watershed plans. And I'll explain this work on the next couple of slides. Go ahead, Sandra. So, using improvements to Ohio's EPA's nutrient mass balance method, we're able to determine total phosphorus runoff load throughout the Maumee River watershed. We did this on the same scale that is used to develop the watershed 9-element plans, and these are the small watersheds known as HUC 12. Now on this map, the total phosphorus runoff yield, or pounds per acre, has been calculated for all of the 186 HUC 12 small watersheds within the greater Miami River watershed. Maumee River watershed. These yields represent the existing loading conditions. All right, so this new work has allowed us to divide up the nutrients delivered to Lake Erie from the Maumee River watershed by the sources of phosphorus. The large pie chart on the left shows that 63% of the spring baseline phosphorus load delivered by the Maumee is from agricultural land within Ohio. Ag land contributes about 85% of Ohio's total portion of phosphorus load. Now, loads from developed land, permitted wastewater treatment, home sewage treatment systems, and then the load from Indiana and Michigan, they're also divided out in this method. The Domestic Action Plan focuses, though, only on Ohio's contributions. And these are baseline or existing loads, and we use them to help calculate the far-field targets. Next slide, please. So for the entire Maumee River watershed, the spring baseline phosphorus load is represented by the bar chart on the left. Now, 2008 is used as our baseline year because that is what the binational Annex 4 reduction goals, that's what they used for their base. And Sandra talked about the Annex 4 goals earlier. The bar chart on the right, it shows the far-field target conditions that are needed to meet the Annex 4 goals. These are a 40% reduction from the baseline. Now, by far field, we mean that these are targets to address a further downstream issue. In this case, it's the harmful algal blooms in western Lake Erie. When we use the term near field, we mean addressing problems within a local watershed. And for this work, though, we're just talking about far field reductions. You can go ahead and advance the slide. The Domestic Action Plan's Appendix A includes the baseline phosphorus spring loads for each source of these small Huck 12 watersheds, and this allows us to determine the far field load for each of those watersheds. And this slide is an example table from those results. Go ahead and advance the slide. So as I mentioned before, the main intent of these far field targets in the Domestic Action Plan are to be used for the local small watershed plans or the 9-element plans. On this map, we can see where 9-element plans are developed or in development throughout Ohio's portion of the Maumee. The ones in blue on this map are in development, and they are specifically focusing on far-field nutrient exports. Next slide, please. So that's it for the far-field target work. We have a couple slides just to talk about the monitoring efforts. I'll quickly mention that this is basically one of the key ways that we track nutrients. The US EPA's Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, the state of Ohio, and many other partners provide funding support for several continuous nutrient monitoring stations throughout Lake Erie's contributing watersheds. USGS and Heidelberg University's National Center for Water Quality Research have stations at USGS streamflow gauges that collect samples at a very high frequency. These methods that are used for monitoring are basically the gold standard in continuously monitoring nutrients when accuracy matters. This map shows where monitoring stations are throughout the Maumee River watershed. They are strategically placed to allow us to understand three major categories. The first is what's being discharged from the major tributaries, and we often call these pour points. The second category is very specific to the Maumee watershed. These are stations that tell us how much nutrients are crossing the state lines. And finally, there are several stations at smaller sized watersheds. Now, each of these were picked to represent a unique set of land use, soil, slopes, and other conditions. Altogether, these stations allow us to track how nutrient runoff changes with different stream flow and rainfall conditions, and more importantly, how we can continue to track how nutrient reductions are occurring as we implement our new projects and plans. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide, and I just wanted to mention that we do have monitoring stations on almost all of the major Lake Erie tributaries, and these two are used to track nutrients across the state. And that's it for my portion, Sandra.
All righty. Next topic, one other thing that we were talking about in the Ohio Domestic Action Plan is our research funding programs. Ohio is funding research to support management actions through, most importantly, the Ohio Department of Higher Education Harmful Algal Bloom Research Initiative. That funding has been provided $8 million since 2015 in order to support a wide range of projects, and there's a lot of coordination. Ohio Sea Grant and the University of Toledo are leading that effort, and the state agencies are very closely involved, determining which research topics are of most interest to the agencies in dealing with the harmful algal blooms and determining what sorts of research products, what questions we have that we need to have answered. So all of those groups are working very closely together to get the best projects possible. And if you go to Ohio Sea Grant's website and look at the HABRI work that's been done, there's quite a great deal of information there. To a lesser extent, we also have a small amount of money provided through the Lake Erie Protection Fund for some research projects. And Ohio Clean Lake 2020, which was part of Senate Bill 299, is providing some money to enhance Ohio Sea Grant facilities to do some of the laboratory work out on the lake. There's also been some federal investments in research through GLRI funds and other funds, most notably through NOAA, some of the modeling work that they have been doing, and USGS in supporting the gauge work and some water quality monitoring. Also USDA, ARS, and other agencies that are doing some research on edge of field and other aspects of the nutrient loss problem. And we've got quite a few universities in Ohio and around the world that have been assisting in this effort. In an adaptive management framework, as the Ohio Domestic Action Plan is, monitoring of system response and tracking towards goals is a necessary function to evaluate actions being taken so that adjustments can be made if needed. It remains imperative to track reduction progress, preferably tied to reduction practices in specific watersheds through a comprehensive and long-term water quality monitoring program, as Paul was just talking about. It's the goal of the overall water quality monitoring strategy in Ohio to include monitoring data from edge of field, subwatershed, Annex 4 priority watersheds, and Lake Erie in order to provide a total picture of nutrient sources and the nutrient delivery system. The primary indicator of progress will be water quality monitoring and associated load calculations at the key downstream station on each of the Annex 4 priority watersheds in Ohio. As part of the H2 Ohio initiative, agricultural BMP projects routed through soil and water conservation districts will be tracked by a digital platform already in use. Metrics reported via this platform are under further development, but could include extent of adoption of agricultural BMPs in terms of number of acres enrolled, number of acres completed, funds committed, and funds dispersed. ODNR wetland metrics will also be tracked. Most of these metrics should be available in the aggregate by county or type of project, for example, by BMP, or if it's an HSTS project or a wetland, and so on. The effort to get that set up is just coming underway, so I don't have a whole lot to show on that yet, but it will be, we'll be working on that pretty intensively very soon. And then, let's see, Ohio EPA is required by law to develop a nutrient mass balance report every 2 years. The objective of the study is to determine nutrient loads and relative proportions of point and non-point sources. So that work is still going on. ODNR is, as part of their effort under H2 Ohio, will be supporting wetland monitoring work, especially in the western Lake Erie Basin and Sandusky Bay. In addition, ODNR is working cooperatively with partners such as Cleveland Water Alliance, the City of Sandusky, Bowling Green State University, and others to develop a low-cost sensor network to monitor water quality within Sandusky Bay and at Old Woman Creek National Estuarine Research Reserve. The Commission has been publishing a water monitoring summary. We have these for each year since 2014. Recently, this was enhanced with the addition of an expanded monitoring report that includes all of the numeric data for the stations referenced in the summary and other stations as well. And we are also providing data via ERIEStat, which is a multi-jurisdictional platform run by the Great Lakes Commission via Blue Accounting. We are also going to be continuing to report, as we have been doing through the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. That's the triennial progress report of the parties, US EPA's annual Annex 4 webinar, and the Lake Erie Action and Management Plan annual reports. So the Lake Erie watershed in Ohio consists of over 7 million acres. The Maumee River alone has over 4 million acres in Ohio. While some progress has been made in the 4 years since the collaborative agreement was first signed, monitoring data in the rivers, for example, here from the Water Monitoring Summary of 2018, and satellite data, for example, as what was put into the HAB Severity Index, indicate there's still a long way to go to meet the targets that have been set. So this is the most recent data that we have from 2018. 2018 was not quite as wet as 2008, as the inset box in the lower right-hand corner is showing the lightest blue bar is 2008, and that is the year that the targets were based on. We want to try to meet those targets 9 years out of 10, that the 1 out of 10 was meant to encompass those very wet years. 2018 was not as wet as 2008, but you can see when you compare the bars on these charts, we were still exceeding that red line, which is where the targets were set. And that's both for dissolved reactive phosphorus and total phosphorus, and both for loads and for concentrations. And then this is the trend over the longer period of time. Again, this is from the 2018 water monitoring summary. Flow-weighted mean concentration, the idea behind that is to try to control for that effect of flow. It's still not great at eliminating completely the effect of flow, but it's a relatively easy way to calculate this. You can see in this case on the left, dissolved reactive phosphorus has kind of leveled off and may possibly be going into a slight declining trend. Total phosphorus has remained pretty flat over the last number of years. We anticipate that the response in the rivers and lakes will continue to be slow because of the need for widespread change. The installation of physical structures and creation of natural features such as wetlands takes time to move through the proposal, design, and construction phases. Education and outreach and the changes in behavior that they are intended to promote also take time to roll out. In addition to the time needed to make these changes, it remains uncertain whether the installation of practices and changes in land management will result in immediate effects or if there's some lag time for nutrients already moving through the system to be removed. This is an area of ongoing research. Despite these challenges, the state of Ohio feels that the new resources and focus provided by H2 Ohio should accelerate the progress we have been making towards achieving the Annex 4 and Ohio Domestic Action Plan goals for nutrient reduction and ultimately a healthier Lake Erie. All right, the next steps. The plan is open for comment for about another week. You can email your comments to the email provided here, or you can snail mail them to the Ohio Lake Erie Commission in Bowling Green. And I'm going to turn it back over. Mary, do we have questions that we are to answer?
Yes, thank you, Sandra and Paul. If you have any clarifying questions, please again type them into the chat, and we will answer them. If we are unable to answer them, or if the question is more for a commission member agency response, we will collect it in the chat to be answered later. So the questions that we've received so far include, is wetland construction focused on coastal wetlands, or will there be an equal number of wetland construction projects located upstream in the watershed? Are coastal wetlands prioritized higher?
I think I'm going to defer that to Ohio DNR. We will be providing, when this final report is posted, we will either incorporate the questions and comments into the domestic action plan, or we will provide a response to comments along with that. And I do want to let DNR weigh in on that one.
Okay. We also received a question about wetlands again. Is it true that wetlands don't just work by trapping sediment? They also work by slowing the flow of a river so that sediment settles out much faster after going through the wetland, resulting in less sediment reaching the lake?
I'll also have DNR respond to that, but that is my understanding, I would say. It was not just nutrients, but also sediment. The flip side of that is at some point it's going to be filling up with sediment, and I'm going to let DNR kind of answer this one more thoroughly.
Okay, thank you. The next question that we received is, the DAP does not include any proposal of a statewide 1.0 micrograms per liter phosphorus concentration limit for NPDES permittees. But we also noticed that there is a table of actions that is under development. Would you please confirm that this table will not include a 1.0 milligrams per liter phosphorus concentration limit statewide?
Sandra, I'll take that one.
Okay.
And speaking is Tiffany Kavalak, Chief of our Division of Surface Water.
Hello. So we already have all of the majors in the Lake Erie Basin at 1 microgram per liter of phosphorus limit, and we don't plan at this point to make any further reductions to the plants in the Lake Erie Basin. And I think the question asks about statewide, and the Lake Erie, the Domestic Action Plan is a Lake Erie specific plan. It's not a statewide plan. So yes, I can confirm there would not be any statewide policy language included into this to be developed table. Oh,
1 milligram.
Milligram per liter, I'm sorry, not microgram.
Yeah,
Yes.
I did the same thing.
Yes, so hopefully that answers that question.
Thank you. The next question is, if an area of water is primarily used for aquatic recreation, such as swimming, that requires immersion into the water and typically results in ingestion of that water, would that area be recommended as a place to create a new flow-through wetland?
I'm going to defer that one and all of the other, if there are other specific questions about wetlands to ODNR. That one's really in their bailiwick, and I'm not really prepared to answer detailed questions about wetlands.
Okay, so then
We will answer all of those later.
Okay, I will make a note of that. Our next question is, should there be some correlation between the portion of funds available to projects to restore Lake Erie and the cost of the project? For example, would using over 11% of the H2 Ohio Fund available to Ohio Department of Natural Resources and Ohio EPA on a project to reduce only 0.1% of the phosphorus load be considered a good use of the funds?
Well, I will say that these types of practices that we are proposing to do were selected in part because they are cost-effective practices. The idea being that you're going to get more bang for your buck and reduce more phosphorus at a lower cost than doing other things. That being said, this is more of a policy question. And again, as far as the specific policy point, we will have a response to this in later comments.
All right, thank you. The next question is, the plan would benefit from a description of the methodology in selecting the restoration projects in Appendix F. The plan would benefit in a description of how dredging waste, to be prohibited in July 2020, will be processed to prevent entrainment phosphorus and the estimated reduction of phosphorus loading to the very good legislation. Very good legislation. Since that is not a question, it's a comment. We will go, unless Sandra, you wanted to respond to that at all.
No, the ones that we're really trying to open it up for questions to clarify what we've presented about the domestic action plan. So I don't want to get too bogged down in responding to comment points because I want to, we will have a response to those developed as part of the eventual final DAP.
Thank you. What will the process use to collect information about all the good actions taking place that are non-agency related? The table that was included in version 1. Yeah,
I do plan to do that. We wanted to get the domestic action plan out on the streets and give folks a chance to see it and respond to it. And I will be following up, as I did before, with my contacts to get those updates on those pieces of information that we had in the previous domestic action plan. I didn't have time to get the whole table done as part of this step.
All righty. Our next question is, parts of the DAP include revisions that were made to the way the nutrient mass balance determines nutrient loading. When will the next nutrient mass balance report be available?
And this is Paul. I can say that we're working hard on that right now. As Sandra mentioned, we're required by state law to come out with that every 2 years. So we would be publishing one this year. We're currently bringing all the data in together from water year 18 and 19 to be included in that report. So by the summer, around the summer.
Thank you. The DAP continues to discuss reductions from each watershed by 40%. Can you share the rationale for doing this for each specific watershed?
I can get to that in the section that I described where we go through each HUC 12, and we broke out a 40% reduction of the various loads. It's just one 40% reduction of all of the load that occurs there, and we think this is a good starting place to use for these 9-element plans. And when a plan is looking at what can be done on this small scale, this HUC 12, you know, maybe they can show that they can have more than 40% reduction in a particular HUC 12.
I will add to the fact that we decided to do it at the HUC 12 level so that the locals could determine what projects they wanted to do versus the state or another entity dictating how to take those reductions. The 9-element plans is an existing tool, and that is a locally driven report.
Okay. Will Ohio EPA modify the discharge permits for discharging home sewage treatment systems? Will we add phosphorus limits?
That is not something we can speak to at this time.
Okay. We did get another question about wetlands, which Sandra said she was going to refer those to ODNR. At this time, I just want to remind folks that they can chat in their questions because we're starting to get to the end of the questions that have been chatted in. The next question is, why is there no plan for meeting the dissolved reactive phosphorus targets?
I think a detailed response to that will be part of the comments, but I will say one of the big struggles that we've had with dissolved reactive phosphorus, because it is so reactive, it's very difficult not just to measure it, for example, out in the lake itself, because it's taken up by the algae so quickly, but it also can be a challenge to measure the exact dynamics of how it operates around some of these BMPs. That's my understanding, that we don't have a whole lot of research on how well BMPs work to reduce dissolved reactive phosphorus. And I am going to have to defer some of that question to Ohio EPA eventually, but we didn't have a whole lot of data on which to base a plan specifically around agricultural BMPs on DRP, as far as I know. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that now, Paul, or if we want to get a better response later.
Somebody just asked who was currently speaking, and that is Sandra Kosek-Stills from the Ohio Lake Erie Commission, who just answered that question. Okay. The next question that we received is, are there any timelines or metrics set out for the execution of H2O Ohio spending or BMP adoption, acres under conservation, number of farmers certified?
The specifics of that are under development. Hope to have more information about that in the next couple of months.
Okay, the next question that we have is, can you share any of the issues that are not in the current draft that are under discussion or consideration?
That's difficult to respond to because it's not very specific. The good thing about what I like about the Ohio Domestic Action Plan is it's very much a living document, and as things are worked on, we try to incorporate that into the Domestic Action Plan. That's one of the reasons why this administration has took its time to make sure that it had a good plan for H2 Ohio. before we updated the domestic action plan. So really what we've been doing is trying to document what's going on, and as things come more to completion, we can add it into the domestic action plan. I have no other comment on that at this time.
Okay. At this time, I do not have any more. Oh, one just came in. There is a question that just came in. There is no mention of climate change in the DAP. Why not, and how might predicted increases in precipitation and storm events change the DAP?
We'll address that in our comments response.
Okay, thank you. At this time, there are no more questions in the chat, so please, if you have questions, start sending them in because we're going to sign off in about 5 minutes or until we exhaust questions. There is one question that has just come in. Is there a cost of implementing the DAP?
We have not developed an economic analysis of the domestic action plan specifically. There will be more information about that around H2 Ohio, I believe, as part of the state budgetary process and reporting back to the legislature, but that would be independent of the domestic action plan.
Okay, that is the last of the questions that I've received so far. We will stay on for about 1 more minute in case anybody else chats in a message, but in the meantime, I'll let folks know that we'd like to thank everyone who participated in the webinar today about the 2020 Draft Domestic Action Plan, and I'll leave the webinar open and chat feature active for about 5 more minutes. If you have any additional comments or questions, or I'll leave it open until 5 p.m. I'm sorry, I forgot that we had it until 5. So I will leave the chat and webinar open until 5 p.m., but we will sign off from the audio portion of the webinar. If you have any additional comments or questions, please continue typing them into the chat until 5 p.m. After the webinar closes, we will accept written comments through March 2nd, 2020, and you can send those comments to dap@lakeerie.ohio.gov. We did get one last question that came in under a few minutes ago. A lot of efforts underway focus on the Maumee River watershed. What actions are planned for the Portage and Sandusky rivers?
Well, H2 Ohio will eventually become a statewide program, so the actions under that for agricultural BMPs and wetland creation, and I believe also HSTS could also apply to the Sandusky and Portage River basins. I'm sure that will also be the next highest priority as the program gets rolled out further.
And just to clarify, the comments are due by the close of business, March 2nd. Again, you can send those to dap@lakeerie.ohio.gov or at the address on the slide on your screen. At this time, we've exhausted, every time I say that, we get a new question. So we got another question in via the chat. So this one is, how will total and dissolved phosphorus reductions be reported? Ohio had an agreement for half the reduction with Ontario and Michigan by 2020. What is the status of that agreement? And how will the TMDL be incorporated in the DAP?
As far as the collaborative, Governor DeWine did recommit to the goal for 2025 to achieve the 40% reduction by then. So we will be reporting as we have been doing with the water monitoring summary and through the other venues, Erie Stat and the progress report of the parties, et cetera, on the monitoring data as it relates to that. As for the second part of that question, we will have to we'll have to see how that plays out. It will be addressed as the following on comments.
Thank you, Sandra. All right, at this time, we will end the audio portion of the webinar. Again, I will leave the chat open until 5, and you can record any questions or comments there. And those will be considered by Ohio Lake Erie Commission. Thank you so much, everybody who participated in today's webinar.